Good evening and welcome to Armor of God Apologetics. I'm your host, Wayne Harsha. Tonight we're going to be doing it a little bit differently in that I actually Zoom broadcasting this for Victory Outreach from my sister's house in Columbia, South Carolina. We are continuing again through both Zoom as well as YouTube Live. If you need the Zoom address or the meeting ID rather, it's 426-303-7843. And again, we are continuing. We're now in part 7 of our 8-part series on the two-part apologetic. So a classic apologetic brings you to God first, and then from God brings you to Jesus Christ and the truth of Christianity. And so we started by our theistic arguments. And the first theistic argument that we covered was the cosmological argument. Then we covered the teleological argument. And then we covered the moral argument. And those are all arguments for the existence of God. Now, as we go on, then we started talking about Jesus of Nazareth, because if you understand what Christians believe about God and Christianity, we believe that Christ was the manifestation of God in human form, or what we call the incarnation. And we talked first about the reliability of the New Testament. Did Jesus exist? What was the evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? And all of those kinds of things. And then we talked last week about, was Jesus God incarnate? Now, many would say actually that the resurrection itself actually proves that Jesus was God. But what we were actually looking at was, did Jesus claim to be God? How did Jesus fulfill prophecy? How did Jesus say that he was God in terms of the deity titles that he took on? And then both the direct and indirect claims of Jesus as to the deity of Jesus Christ. This week, we're going to take on, honestly, what is probably the easiest of the arguments, and that is, did Jesus die on a Roman cross? And then next week, we'll kind of wrap it all up by using the minimal facts approach and looking at the resurrection of Jesus. Now, part of the reason that I'm leading into it is because the first of the minimal facts approach at the resurrection is, did Jesus die on a Roman cross? So we got to kind of cross that bridge, and that'll give us a good transition into next week, because there's a lot of stuff that we can cover next week. So again, we talked about, did Jesus exist? Then we talked about, was Jesus God incarnate? And now we're going to talk about, did Jesus die on a Roman cross? And to talk about that, we're going to talk about scourging as well as crucifixion. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between Jewish scourging, which was a punishment, and Roman scourging. Then we're going to talk about Roman crucifixion and what it was like, some of the records about it. Has anybody ever survived it? Those types of things. And then we're going to talk about the gospel accounts and what they say about the scourging and trial and beating of Jesus even prior to getting to the cross. What does it say about the cross? And then we're going to talk about some extra biblical accounts and corroboration of the biblical accounts that Jesus, in fact, did die on a Roman cross. And then we're going to actually cover, as many of you know, I'm a physician, and we're going to talk about the Journal of the American Medical Association, which actually published a paper in 1986 about the death of Jesus on a Roman cross. Now, some of you might ask the question, why ask the question, did Jesus die on a Roman cross? And here is the prime reason why. Although most scholars almost universally will say Jesus did die on a Roman cross, there is about 2 billion people in the world that are Muslims. And in the Quran, it reads in Surah, which is the same as a chapter, Surah 4, Ayah, which is the same thing as verse, Ayah 157 and 158, it says, and for their saying, indeed, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them. And indeed, those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of assumption, and they did not kill him for certain. So what it is saying about, and the Quran, by the way, calls Jesus Isa, what they are saying about Isa, the Messiah, the son of Mary, was that Jesus was not crucified, that in fact, God put someone else in his place, basically to resemble him and that the apostles were wrong, that it was not Jesus on the cross, and that's why he appeared 3 days later. And they actually believed God brought Jesus to heaven in the same way that Elijah of the Old Testament was brought up. Now, again, what are the bottom line about the Surah 4, 157 and 158? The Jews, did not kill him, Jesus, nor did they crucify him. Another was made to resemble him, and they did not kill him for certain. So those are the things that are in the Quran. So you have about 2 billion people that are actually saying Jesus was not killed on the cross. If you don't know, Muslims actually believe that Jesus was a prophet, just not the Son of God and not God incarnate. So let's talk now about Roman scourging and crucifixion. Cicero called crucifixion the extreme and ultimate punishment of slaves. And that it was the cruelest and most disgusting penalty. And it was oftentimes for not only people who were in jail, prisoners, but also slaves, and as a form of punishment specifically to those slaves. Josephus called it the most pitiable of deaths. It was considered to be a sign of damnation to the Jews, because there's an Old Testament verse about damnation for anyone who is hanged on a tree. And it typically was done with what was called the Roman flagellum or flagrum. The Roman flagellum oftentimes nowadays will be called the cat of nine tails, or sometimes it's called a scorpion. And the reason for that is that it looked like this. The Roman flagellum had a leather or wooden handle that was roughly 6 inches long, similar to what we might think of as a tennis racket handle. It would have
Hey, Wayne, I lost your audio. I can't hear you. Got no sound. No sound.
It was working just fine. I'm double checking. Talk to me again.
I can hear you now, but not him.
No, it seems like it cut off, Wayne.
Can you guys hear me at all now?
Yes.
Yes.
They're perfect.
Yes.
All right, so not sure why that did that, but we'll keep going now. So it had a leather or wooden handle, and it had, the reason that it had these things built into the leather thongs was that it would, the heavier pieces would bruise the flesh, bring blood to the surface, and then the glass or the metal hooks would then dig into the flesh and pull the flesh as it is they would hello.
You're kind of going in and out.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Okay.
All right, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, now it's coming through.
All right.
Make sure you have everyone muted.
I do. All right, let's keep going and try to do this. Sorry about the technical difficulties, a little bit tougher when I'm in a different environment. Helen, can you hear me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, good. So what they would do, again, everybody who went to a Roman cross would actually be scourged prior to them going to the Roman cross. And what they would do is they'd bring them into an open area. In the Bible, it's described as the praetorium, and they would attach them to a beating post. And there's actually one that you can see if you go to Jerusalem, and it actually is made out of granite, and you can actually see scratch marks in it from where it has been hit by the Roman flagellum. And it was such an instrument that it could even scratch at granite, believe it or not. And they would strike them with kind of an oblique angle, striking them around the shoulders, the back, the lower back, and even the buttocks and upper legs. And it is said that oftentimes the scourging would be so bad that you would actually see the bones of their ribs, and at times would actually see pieces of muscle and flesh hanging off of their body. Now, Jewish scourging was actually done very similarly, and it's actually described in the Old Testament, but it was considered that 40 stripes would oftentimes lead to the death of an individual. So it was 40 minus 1, or 39. But that was not the case in terms of Roman scourging. And in fact, in Roman scourging, there was no limit to the number of lashes. And in fact, depending on how bad the offense was, they would oftentimes beat them actually to the point of death. So many a times these prisoners would actually never make it to the cross. They would actually die in the praetorium, being beaten to death due to blood loss. So that gives you an idea of how bad the scourging was. Now, there was actually a team meant for this, and the centurion would actually sometimes stop what we'll call lictors in order to allow the criminal to actually go on to the cross. So the whole idea was to beat them near death, but not actually kill them. But again, sometimes it would actually result in death, almost certainly because of blood loss and hypovolemic shock. So Roman crucifixion, it derives from the late Latin crucifixionem, and it is a noun of action from past participle stem. To fasten to a cross is all it really means. Now, in fact, Romans, many people don't know this, but Romans didn't invent crucifixion. In fact, it was invented by the Persians in the 6th century BC. Alexander the Great then brought it to the Mediterranean area in the 4th century BC, and the Phoenicians likely were the ones that introduced it into Rome in about the 3rd century BC. But it is said that the Romans actually perfected crucifixion. Again, it was held only for slaves, rebels, pirates, enemies, and criminals, and it was considered a very humiliating thing to do to people, in large part because despite what the movies like The Passion of the Christ show, there was actually usually no loincloth on them. They were stripped naked and hung up for everyone to see. Roman citizens were exempt unless they were convicted of treason, in which case they could also be crucified as well. And it was considered a very slow, agonizing death, sometimes between hours and days worth of hanging on the tree. And oftentimes, in order to further shame even the families of the people being crucified, the bodies were actually left on the cross for days, even after their death, for vultures and other birds of prey to come and pick at the carrion from it. Now, again, all of the convicted criminals were first scourged, and then they were made to carry the cross. Now, of course, the Bible describes them carrying their cross, and there's other Roman literature that describes it as well. But in reality, most of the time, they were actually given what is called the patibulum. So wood in many of the Roman areas, and especially in Jerusalem, wood large enough to actually hang someone on the cross was fairly rare. So what in fact was described in much of the ancient literature was they would leave the upright piece in place. It was more of a permanent fixture. And then with a mortise and tenon joint, the actual cross beam was what would be carried from the praetorium out to Golgotha, or wherever they were actually being crucified. At times, by the way, they would crucify them along the city walls during certain times of persecution. But just this crossbeam was anywhere from about 75 to 150, 200 pounds. Now you got to understand these were, in general, more trim people at the time, and even carrying a crossbeam where typically their arms were lashed to the beam to be able to carry it. That patibulum, carrying that on your shoulders, is obviously a very arduous task. And they would often be made to carry it 3/4 of a mile, a mile and a quarter, quite a long way. Now, the crucifixion teams by the Romans were typically 5 people total: a centurion, which you can think of kind of like a sergeant or an officer, and 4 soldiers who would actually be the ones nailing the person, the patibulum, up to the upright piece, and therefore putting them on the cross. Remember, these were specialized teams. These were trained professional killers. Now, the vertical beam, so again, the patibulum was the cross piece. The vertical piece was called the stipes. And these were, again, oftentimes permanent. Now, remember, these people, these convicts, were then stripped of all of their clothing. So as they were nailed, as their patibulum was put up onto the stipes, you got to understand then their back, which has been scourged, all of those wounds are then going to be reopened. And so, although oftentimes it is felt that blood loss was not the reason they died, it certainly helped speed the death at times, because they would continue to bleed throughout their time because their back was resting against this stipe. Now, there were many configurations, and there's some doubt about the configuration of Jesus's cross. Most people believe it to be either a true cross, and you can see the different names there, or perhaps the more common T-shaped cross. There were X or Y-shaped ones as well, and sometimes, if wood was very scarce, they would actually just crucify them with their hands above their head, driving it in that way, and then driving their feet in, and it would just be a vertical cross. Now, they were nailed in typically with tapered iron spikes. Part of how we know this is actually there was an ossuary or bone box found in Jerusalem a while back, and they measured out the spike. It was actually of a heel bone, and they were about 5 to 7 inches, so about 13 to 18 centimeters long. They had a square shaft about 3/8 of an inch across, and of course a head on the end of them. Now, Jesus' crucifixion is always depicted in movies as being truly through like the palm of the hand. The problem is twofold. Even in today's society, like orthopedic surgeons, the wrist and hand are essentially considered one unit. And back then, specifically in the Greek language, the hand was considered the distal wrist and beyond. And so, in fact, if you nail through the hand itself, likely the weight would actually pull completely through. So we know from literature 2 things. Number one, that they oftentimes would actually take it between the radius and the ulna, where there is more support. And number 2, in addition to nailing, they would oftentimes tie them also to the cross to support them. So just because it has been found out that it's in the wrist, that does not make there a discrepancy in the Bible when it talks about his hands and his feet being nailed. It's simply our misinterpretation. They considered the wrist and hand also all the hand. Now, oftentimes they had, but not always, they would have what was called a sedile or sedulum, which is, we usually see it pictured in movies as being where they nailed the feet in. According to literature, other ancient literature on crucifixion, it depended again on what they happened to have there. Sometimes, if the stipe was this way, they would actually put the feet beside the cross and nail sideways into the cross. Sometimes the sedulum was in the front, and they would nail the feet to that. But sometimes it is actually described as the sedulum, being further up in the midsection region, and they would actually, believe it or not, sometimes nail the genitals of males to the sedulum. So it was meant to humiliate and torture the person as much as actually kill them. Now, again, it was oftentimes hours to days, and we even see the description in the Bible, and there's evidence elsewhere in both literature and in ossuaries that they would sometimes break the legs, especially if they wanted to hasten the death. Now you have to understand when people are hung up with their arms outstretched like that and their feet nailed into the cross, what would happen is, as their weight would sag down, remember they were weakened from their beating and their scourging, the weight would hang down and you could breathe in, but you couldn't breathe out. And so what you would have to do is push up on your feet, which of course would be excruciating, because, by the way, that's where the term excruciating comes from, is the word crucifixion. You would push up with your feet in order to exhale. Well, if you think about that, as you would push up, your back would rub against the stipe, and the perhaps clotted wounds on your back would then be reopened, and you would bleed more once again. So you would repeat this process, taking shallow breaths until you really had to breathe out well. You would stand up on the nailed feet, breathe out, breathe in again, and then sag back down. So what they would do to hasten the death is they'd break the legs, and they actually have pictures of kind of a big mallet type of instrument that they would break the legs with. And this would hasten the death. Most of the time, it is felt that the death was a combination, mostly of asphyxiation, but also pleural effusion. So in other words, fluid building up in the lungs, as well as pericardial effusion. In other words, fluid building up around the heart, in addition to shock and dehydration. So many different ways to get through, to kill someone through crucifixion. Now, some have asked, well, has anyone ever survived crucifixion? And there's actually one instance that we know of where one person lived after being crucified. And in reality, he was only kind of partially crucified, if you will. So Josephus, which we talked about last week in terms of, 2 weeks ago, in terms of, did Jesus actually exist? Josephus was a very famous historian, Jewish historian, and he had some inroads with the Romans. And when he was coming back into the city at one point, he saw 3 of his friends and colleagues being crucified along with hundreds of others at the city walls. And he begged Titus for their removal. They were all 3 taken down and given medical care by Rome, the quote unquote best of Roman physicians. 2 of them still died under physician's care. So as we know it, only one person that we know of has ever survived crucifixion. And again, he was actually purposely taken down before crucifixion was finished. So what do the gospel accounts say about Jesus? Well, I want to take you all the way from his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, because it kind of lends credence as to some of the things it says later in the gospel accounts. And keep in mind, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it talks about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, first of all, one of those actually talks about Jesus being so stressed that he sweat tears of blood, and that is actually a known medical condition. But in addition to that, he was arrested in Gethsemane, and he was actually beaten by the Jews on his way to the high priest. Now, once he underwent his trial with the Sanhedrin, it also describes him being struck and hit about the head. So he was beaten by the time before, at least once, if not twice, before he ever even got to Pontius Pilate. Now, keep in mind, the last time he's had anything to eat or drink is the evening of Thursday, which is when he was arrested. So then he goes to Pontius Pilate, and after his trial and being sent to Herod and coming back, he was sentenced to being flogged. And then he goes out and he was flogged. Now, not only was he scourged, but the Greek wording, when you look at the New Testament, the Greek wording of how it describes his scourging, it was the wording they use implicates that it was actually a very vicious scourging, very vicious beating. Not only that, they then describe putting a robe on him. Now, if you know anything about clotting, when you put cloth onto something that is bleeding, like taking a Kleenex and shoving it in your nose when you have a nosebleed, it actually stimulates clot formation. So they put a scarlet robe on him. And then they actually describe striking him about the head with a stick. Not only that, they put a crown of thorns on his head. Now, most Americans, when we think thorns, we think the thorns of a rose bush or the thorns of a blackberry bush, very small thorns. That's not the kind of thorns that grow in the Holy Land. These are described as 2 to 3 inches in length, and it was placed on his head. And it is believed that likely that actually penetrated all the way down to the skull. Now, anyone who's ever seen a skull split open, which I have, or a scalp split open, you can actually bleed out just from scalp wounds, okay? So that also lends to his blood loss. So not only that, it then describes them taking the scarlet robe off of him. Now, if he had had enough time to do any clotting, then when they rip it off, that is not only terrible pain, but it's going to reopen the bleeding wounds. So now you have someone who has not eaten for about or drank anything for somewhere between 12 and 18 hours. He's been beaten, he's been scourged, and now they're ripping these off of him and opening his wounds again, and he has a crown of thorns on his head, all leading to likely shock and dehydration, volumetric shock. And then he was made to carry his cross about 3/4 of a mile out to Gethsemane, and at that point, he was crucified between 2 criminals. Again, remember what we said there. Every time someone would push up to breathe, they would reopen some of their wounds and thereby bleed even more. So let's look at some of the extra biblical accounts. So Tacitus, as we talked about in a couple weeks ago, he talked about, he wrote between 56 and 120 AD. He was a great Roman historian. And Tacitus, who was a Roman, no friend of the Christians, wrote, Nero created scapegoats and subjected to the most refined tortures those whom the common people called Christians, hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ, who during the reign of Tiberius had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Okay, so Tacitus, a Roman historian, verifies Jesus died. In addition to that, Josephus, or Flavius Josephus, who wrote between 37 and 100 AD, again, a Jewish soldier, politician, and historian, he says Jesus is described as being condemned under Pontius Pilate. Now, all that being said, let's look at what some of the modern writings of the Medical Association, the Journal of the American Medical Association says. And the title of the article was called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, written by William Edwards, MD, as well as Wesley Gable, who's MDiv, and Floyd Hosmer, who was their associate, and it was published in 1986. And they looked at writings of ancient Christians, non-Christian authors, writings of modern authors, the Shroud of Turin, and they use legal historical method of scientific investigation. So they were looking at things like multiple attestation, was there attesting of more than one independent source, and things of that sort. First of all, the first thing that the authors talk about is Gethsemane and Luke's description and being in agony. He prayed more earnestly and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And they talk in this article about what is called hematidrosis or hemohidrosis, which is sweating or sometimes tearing blood, basically because the stress level gets so high that capillaries in either the sweat glands or in the tear glands actually begin to bleed. So this is a known medical condition. Again, they talk about the 12 hours between 9 p.m. roughly Thursday evening and 9 a.m. Friday. They talk about the emotional distress as evidenced by the hematidrosis, the abandonment by his closest friends. Remember, Peter had denied him 3 times. Judas had betrayed him. He then got beaten after the first Jewish trial and is described as being beaten on his way to the trial. He had a traumatic and sleepless night where he was not given any food or water. And then he was forced to walk somewhere around 2.5 miles because remember, they had eaten the Last Supper within the city walls, traveled out to the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, and then was brought back in to the high priest. So he had walked somewhere around 2.5 miles that night. So he was already tired and abandoned and stressed, which actually puts you at more vulnerability to the adverse effects of scourging and blood loss and dehydration. He was then scourged and a robe placed on him. Again, the robe was taken off, reopening the wounds, and he was made to carry his patibulum, which would have been probably somewhere around 100 pounds. Now, again, as they talk about in this article, the scourging was meant to actually weaken the condemned man. Sometimes the blood loss would be considerable. This would give orthostatic hypotension and hypovolemic shock. What would that lead to? Well, weakness and dizziness. And we see in the Bible where it's described that Jesus was so weakened by the beating that he was unable to carry his cross, and Simon of Cyrene had to be conscribed by the Romans to actually carry his cross. Again, they were then thrown to the ground, the scourging wounds opening, and every respiration reopening the wound. Again, this interferes with normal respiration, especially exhalation. And what does that do? It makes very shallow breaths. When you can't breathe out, your carbon dioxide level goes up. That's what hypercarbia is. That leads to more cramping, which actually further hinders respiration, because if your body is cramping, then you have a harder time pulling yourself up and pushing yourself up in order to then breathe out more. So it's a self-fulfilling cycle that just keeps getting worse and worse. And then, as they put it, the two most prominent causes of death, typically a combination of asphyxiation, or basically being smothered to death by your own inability to breathe out or breathe in, and hypovolemic shock. Other things like dehydration and some stress-induced arrhythmias of the heart, perhaps even congestive heart failure because of filling of the heart sac with fluid because of all the trauma and the shock, as well as filling of the lung cavities with fluid called a pleural effusion. Now, in addition to that, it is described not only in the Bible, but elsewhere that a spear would be jabbed in the side. This, by the way, was probably an infantry spear that had somewhere around a 6 to 8 inch blade on the end of a 5 to 6 foot stick. And that's a spear in the side typically was described as going in the right side. Now, in the book of John, we see a description of the flow of blood and water. Now, oftentimes, this would be considered, so when we look at what this would have been considered, some people doubted the water, and some people have said things like, well, he urinated, or maybe they stabbed him in the bladder. But as it turns out, as people have studied the physiology of crucifixion, one of the things, again, was that we have found that likely the heart sac and the lung sacs would have been filled with fluid, or partially filled with fluid. And if you stabbed through the right side, likely the right side of the heart would have been penetrated, either the right atrium, the smaller chamber of the heart, or the right ventricle, causing the flow of blood, and then either that sac, the fluid of sac around the heart or around the lungs. When that fluid accumulates, it really does look basically like kind of straw-colored water. And so that corroborates the description in John of the flow of blood and water, which obviously, if your heart is penetrated, if you weren't already dead, you would be. And it is described in the Bible that they pierced him but broke the legs of those beside him, because the centurions, who again, remember, were professional killers who were specialized teams for crucifixion, already knew he was dead, but ensured it by piercing him. And there's no description of him having any kind of reaction at all. And their conclusion is this, and I'm going to read it for you. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium, that's the sac around the heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So what's the conclusion? Well, I'm going to give you the conclusion based on atheist biblical scholars. Guys like John Dominic Crossan, who is an atheist biblical scholar, one of the co-founders of the Jesus Seminars, who said Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from two authors not among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus. In addition, atheist Gerd Ludemann says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Robert Miller, also of the Jesus Seminar, says we can be certain that Jesus really existed, despite a few highly motivated skeptics who refused to be convinced, that he was a Jewish teacher in Galilee and that he was crucified by the Roman government around 30 CE. And then atheist Gerd Ludemann also says, sorry, that one, I got that one in there twice, but Bart Ehrman, who is also a very well-known agnostic atheist skeptic, says the same thing, that Jesus' death on the cross is as undeniable a fact. In fact, he says, the thing we probably know the best about Jesus is that Jesus died on a cross. So if you look back at the Quran, Surah 4, Ayah 157 and 158, it simply does not hold. Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross at the time of Tiberius Caesar under the rule of Pontius Pilate in the Holy Land. Much of what I got, I listed from some of the historical websites that I got it off of in the presentation itself. I also got quite a bit from evidence that demands a verdict. And again, Jesus and the God of Israel that I talked about last week. And with that, I will wrap it up a little early and answer any questions that you guys have. Sorry for the technical difficulties that we had.
You just wanted to make sure we slept well tonight, didn't you?
Is everybody still hearing me okay, by the way? Give me a thumbs. Helen, will you give me a thumbs up if you can still hear? Okay, perfect. Awesome. So I'm actually going to flip over to YouTube Live. Okay, and I don't see any further comments there. So, Helen, do you have any questions for me this week?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
That I talked about last week. With that, sorry, give me just a moment. Wrap it up a little early and answer any I'm trying to figure out how I can. Sorry for getting an echo from my from YouTube. So
you just wanted to make sure we slept well tonight, didn't you?
Is everybody still hearing me okay? Did I sleep well? Am I going to sleep well tonight? Yeah, I'm going to sleep okay tonight. Yeah. It's only 9:39. It's not too bad. YouTube Live. Okay, and I don't see any further comments there. Any other questions for me? All right. Well, I hope all of you enjoyed this, and we will meet you same time, same channel next week, and we will wrap it up with the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. With that, I hope everybody's having a great week, and love all you guys. God bless.